Hey, what is up guys? Welcome to MST.TV. Today I am bringing you all my ban list prediction for the January 2020 ban list. Now with the list only being about a week or two away, I wanted to show you all my predictions and what I think is going to be happening on the list because there are a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration. We have to look at all of the different meta decks, including how long they've been in the meta for, and decide how we want to hit each of them, if at all. We have a bunch of new cards coming to the game from the release of sets like Ignition Assault, Legendary Duelist Magical Hero, and Dual Overload. And of course we have the Master Rule changes coming to the game in April. Now one final thing to note is that over the last little while, we have been getting a new ban list every few months, so I think that there's a very good chance we're going to see another ban list sometime in April, after we've had a couple of weeks to see how the Master Rule changes have affected the meta. While we're definitely due for a bit of a meta refresh, it's hard to say if that refresh is going to come with this list, or if it'll wait until the new Master Rule changes come into effect. That being said, please take this list with a grain of salt. These are just the changes that I think are going to happen, and my opinions are probably going to differ quite a bit from each of yours. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so first up we have Tempest Magician as our first banned card. So this one is a bit of a preemptive hit, but I think it's important to address this card as something that enables FTKs. So Tempest Magician is one of those older cards that can now very easily inflict 8,000 or more damage to your opponent during turn 0. So if your opponent doesn't happen to draw like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, they kind of just lose. Now with decks like Pendulum being able to dig through the deck and flood the graveyard with spells so easily, setting up FTKs with Tempest Magician is actually easier than ever before. Furthermore, they even get a new enabler that generates a ton of spell counters for free in Selene, the Endymion link that will theoretically be coming to the game in Dual Overload. Overall, I think that there's a lot of potential for Tempest Magician to be abused, and I don't think that FTKs are healthy for the game at all. I don't actually think that anything outside of these FTK type decks even utilizes Tempest Magician, so I don't think it's really going to be all that missed. So yeah, in order to proactively stop an FTK deck from finding its way into the meta in the near future, I definitely think that Tempest Magician is a card that needs to be banned. The next banned card that we have is Outer Entity Azathoth, a hit that is the same as what the OCG did. So this card was previously abused with Phantom Knights, as you could summon it during your opponent's turn to effectively prevent them from playing the game. It prevents your opponent from activating monster effects at all during the turn in which it is summoned, so even though you can only now make it during your own turn, it effectively shuts off all monsters on your opponent's board, as well as stops them from being able to activate hand traps against you. Even more silly is the fact that it's effective the moment the card hits the field. You can't stop this card with cards like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, making it even harder to play around. Looking at Yu-Gi-Oh! Today, most decks in the game are dependent on monster effects in some way, whether they be effects on the field, from the hand, or from the graveyard, and Azathoth just shuts off all of them. Being able to shut off all of those effects for free and give yourself a turn without any potential disruption from your opponent is just a bit too strong, and furthermore the new Master Rule adjustment coming into effect means that this card is easier to summon than ever before, definitely looking abusable in a deck like Lunalight Orcus. Overall, I think that the card is just too disruptive and lacks any sort of real counterplay, and I definitely think that it should be banned on the upcoming list. The final ban that I have on my list is Orchestrated Babel, and I think that this kind of seems to be like the common consensus for how to hit the Orcus deck moving forward. Now, in and of itself, I think that a lot of the Orcus cards are actually quite fair. Like Galatea is a really key card in the deck, but its effect is pretty simple and it doesn't really seem broken by any means. Dingirsu is a really powerful effect monster that's difficult to get over, but so are a lot of different boss monsters, and for the most part, all of the different Orcus main deck monsters have reasonably simple and straightforward uses. The thing that is most unfair about the Orcus deck is the ability to do the things that it does during both players' turns, sort of bypassing their hard once per turn conditions and using those effects to disrupt your opponent. For instance, I don't think that summoning Dingirsu and sending an opponent's card to the graveyard without targeting is inherently broken. It's really good, but it's not too broken. But what I do think is broken is being able to do that in the middle of your opponent's combo and then again during your following turn. When combined with the effect of something like IP Masquerena to bring out Nightmare Unicorn, the deck just has too many really strong points of interaction with your opponent during their turn. Now, the other Orcus card that I considered hitting was Harp Horror, being one of the main deck monsters used in the deck to combo off, but I wanted to avoid hitting one of the few main deck monsters that the deck has access to. Without Babel, I feel like Orcus are a mostly fair strategy, as they can set up decent boards and take advantage of cards like Orcus Crescendo or Orchestrated Return still. They just won't be able to do it during both players' turns, which is a much more reasonable state for the deck to exist in. If the deck still proves to be too strong, there is of course the April 2020 ban list that should be able to address the deck moving forward, but I think that banning Babel hits the deck hard enough to make it fair, but leaves the deck's core playstyle intact. So as you guys will have undoubtedly noticed, I haven't banned Hornet Drones, Multi-Roll, or Kagari, and that is because I believe that the only appropriate way to hit Sky Strikers this ban list is to limit Engage. So I actually got a bunch of hate when I talked about this before, as people were talking about how Engage wasn't a card that needed to be hit, and that hitting something like Widow Anchor was just fine. However, I think that we need to hit Engage in order to stop people from abusing Sky Strikers as an engine that generates free card advantage. Now, at the moment, Sky Strikers Pure are by all means a fair deck. The deck doesn't do anything too ridiculous, and while the deck is good, it's not nearly as broken as before, which is why I haven't really touched Multi-Roll, and I don't think that Kagari needs to be hit either. However, I believe that Engage still needs to be hit because as long as it remains at 3, the card is going to be played and abused in different decks. I see a lot of people talking about how Hornet Drones being banned would stop the engine from being splashed into everything, and I understand why you would think that, because Hornet Drones has historically been the primary card that's abused by the engine. But I'm going to have to ultimately disagree. I think that even if Hornet Drones were banned, people will still find ways to take advantage of Engage as an engine, especially when played alongside with utility cards like Widow Anchor, Shark Cannon, Afterburners, and Jamming Waves. Engage just has so much potential and generates so much advantage. All of those utility cards that I just mentioned are really solid in and of themselves, and the fact that they're all now still searchable with Engage seems kind of silly to me. And there are so many different decks that can get spells into the grave easily that you're probably going to be getting that extra draw off of Engage when you do resolve it most of the time. Overall, this card is just way too strong to be a part of the meta anymore. As long as Engage exists in the game in multiples, there's too much possibility for the card to be abused as a free advantage generating engine, and so I think this is finally going to be the list where we see Engage go to 1. Next up, I have Thunder Dragon Colossus going to 1. Now, this is in some ways a preemptive hit for Thunder Dragons leading up to the Master Rule adjustment, and in other ways, it's a hit to Thunder Dragons to stop them from taking over the meta when other decks get hit. Now, to be honest, I don't believe that Thunder Dragons need to be hit at all right now. I actually think that this is one of the more fair decks in the game under Master Rule 4. However, under the Master Rule adjustment coming in April, Thunder Dragon Colossus at 3 is just so easy to abuse, as you don't need to worry about your zoning at all when you're playing this card. You can literally turn all of your monsters into Colossus for free without worrying about that zoning, which is just kind of ridiculous. Having access to only one Colossus forces Thunder Dragon players to be smarter. With Colossus at 3, it's very easy to abuse the card and use it to make like Thunder Dragon Titan or different rank 8 monsters. Alternatively, ending the board with multiple Colossus on board is very difficult to get through, and breaking through it is impossible for some decks. But by limiting Colossus, Thunder Dragon players have to manage their resources a bit better and think about if they want to utilize the Colossus as an Xyz material or leave it on the board. In hitting Colossus, we stop the deck from completely taking over when other meta decks get hit, and we open the way a little bit for other decks to come into the meta. Okay, so admittedly, this is going to be one of those weirder cards that people are probably going to say I'm crazy for, but I can't shake the feeling that Into the Void is a card that is potentially going to be addressed on the ban list. Now, in my mind, the card is extremely comparable to Upstart Goblin. Playing 3 copies of it along with Upstart Goblin effectively turns your deck from having 40 cards to 36 cards, allowing you to turbo your way into key combo pieces much more easily. At the same time, it generates spell counters for free on cards like Servant of Endymion. Now, I don't actually think that Pendulums need to be addressed on the ban list directly at all at the moment. I think that Servant of Endymion is actually a pretty balanced, reasonably strong card. Into the Void is one of those cards that is played to minimize the number of cards in your deck, where you accept the possibility of not getting to your end combo and having to discard your hand, because you know that your deck has few enough cards that you're not going to have to get to that point, right? You're probably going to be able to resolve your combo after turboing into it. At 1 though, that risk is mitigated less, so it's definitely less likely to be abused. I think that overall, this is probably the ban list change I've included here that is least likely to happen, but in my opinion, I think that it would be very consistent with other past ban list hits and should be considered as a possibility at the very least. And the last card to be limited is one that should be coming off the ban list, and I don't think it's going to surprise anyone in the slightest. We have Tribe Infecting Virus coming to 1. This card probably could have come off the ban list several years ago and wouldn't have made a difference to the meta whatsoever, but for whatever reason, the card is still banned. Now, outside of being a really mediocre side deck option in Mermails, I don't really see where I would want to play this card. However, we just had a new card announced in the OCG coming in Eternity Code called Arch Nemesis Shadows, which is basically like a really big Tribe Infecting Virus that doesn't burn your normal summon, doesn't require a discard, and locks both players from special summoning that type of monster until the end of the next turn. It's literally like 100 times better than Tribe Infecting Virus in every single way, and basically this card like guarantees to us that Tribe Infecting Virus will be coming off the ban list sometime very soon. Okay, next up we are on to the semi-limits, and I actually have several cards included here. On the last OCG ban list, we actually saw a ton of cards being semi-limited, so I think that we're probably going to see a few cards semi-limited here as well. Typically, I reserve these spots for cards that were limited and are coming to 2 before going to 3. So first up we have Emergency Teleport, a card that is currently limited. Honestly, I don't think Emergency Teleport is a very broken card at the moment. It just brings out a psychic monster from your deck, which is probably like a tuner or something, so maybe for Needle Fiber. We do have Quick Launch, a rocket quick play spell card that does basically the same thing, still at 3, and Cosmos aren't really a big enough threat that E-Telly needs to stay hit. I think that it would be an okay option for some decks that really need to go into like Needle Fiber, allowing you to pull a tuner out from the deck like Kraybons. However, I think the big reason that this card will be moved from limited to semi-limited status is that the card is used in Shaddoll's, as it can be used to bring out Lai Shaddol Wendy from the deck, who can then special summon another Shaddol out of your deck when Lai Shaddol Wendy is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. With the Shaddol structure deck coming to the TCG in February, bringing E-Telly off the list a little bit will hopefully nudge players in the direction of playing Shaddols, so now I think is the perfect time for the card to go to 2. The next semi-limit that we have is Thunder Dragon Hawk, which is just a consistency hit for Thunder Dragons. So I know that I said that Thunder Dragons don't need to be hit, but this is a ban list prediction video, and I think that there's a very good chance that we're going to see the Thunder Dragon get hit in a way other than just limiting Colossus. In the OCG, Colossus and Hawk were both limited, and the deck was still a relatively decent top contending deck after everything else had been hit. So after we see these hits, we need to further address the Thunder Dragon deck to stop it from taking over the meta. I don't think that Hawk needs to be limited. I think that that would hurt the consistency of this deck a little bit too much. However, I think that by semi-limiting Hawk, you hit the deck's consistency just enough that the deck is slightly less viable than before. Now, there aren't really any other cards in the archetype that I felt could be hit. I think that the Thunder Dragon Fusion spell card is a really strong card, and that hitting it would be great, but hitting that card would be too much, and it would eliminate the deck's ability to recycle the one Colossus that I have limited. So hitting Hawk is the best, most reasonable alternative hit, something that hurts the deck without completely killing it off. Our third semi-limit is Book of Moon, a card that I feel like has basically been on the ban list forever, but is also something that I feel like everyone thinks should come off the list. Book of Moon is an inherent neg 1, and the chances of someone abusing it with Magician of Faith, the way that it was abused back in something like GOAT format, are really, really low. However, Book of Moon stayed limited for the longest time, I think largely because of Master Rule 4 and the changes that it brought about. If you were to Book of Moon a monster in your opponent's extra monster zone, you could essentially end their turn, as they couldn't change the battle position, set up link arrows, or link the monster away. However, with the Master Rule 2020 adjustments, this is no longer a really big worry, as Synchro, Ixies, and Fusion-based decks can summon their extra deck monsters to any of the other zones, and links cannot be turned into defense mode. Either with this list or the April 2020 list, we are most likely finally going to be seeing Book of Moon get rid of its limited status. Next, we have Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf. So even despite Gazelle and Circle being limited, Salamangrates are still a really solid competitive meta deck. The deck has an amazing grind game, and it is still able to pull off its combos like every turn quite consistently. Once you have cards like Spinny, Falco, or Jack Jaguar in your graveyard, as well as Gazelle in your hand, you can basically perform the same combos every single turn, which combined with hand traps can outgrind almost any deck in the game. Now, while I don't think that the deck is broken or overpowered, I think it's very similar to Thunder Dragons in that we need to hit the deck in some way in order to ensure that it doesn't take over the meta after everything else gets hit. Now, there's nothing in the Salamangreat decks that is inherently like overly strong. All of the main deck monsters outside of Gazelle are actually fairly weak. My decision is to semi-limit Sunlight Wolf to hurt the consistency with which the deck is able to go for its entire combo turn after turn. By semi-limiting Sunlight Wolf, the deck can still reincarnate summon him and get its effect, but it can't necessarily do that every single turn. It needs to rely on Jack Jaguar putting the Sunlight Wolf back and staying on the field, making the deck a lot slower if Sunlight Wolf gets removed from the field. This hit also forces Salamangrates to consider alternative lines of play, such as using other Salamangrate Link monsters, or at least other more generic ones. Alright guys, the last semi-limit here is Necros of Unicorn. So we have cards like Brionac and Shrit off the list, and really, Necros haven't done anything like competitively. I did actually lose to this deck over the weekend. I couldn't out Unicorn for some reason. Shoutouts to you, Caleb. But cards like Vanity's Ruler and Zaborg the Mega Monarch are cards that can win games on their own, and the fact that each of them can be brought out fairly easily and consistently by the Necros decks is pretty cool. However, Necros just aren't what they once were before, and the deck really does have a hard time against a lot of the meta decks. That being said, I think that Necros of Unicorn can pretty safely come back to 2. Necros are a really popular fan favorite deck, and I think that people would be excited to have Necros as an anti-meta option for all the different decks that we're going to be seeing come back into the game after the Master Rule adjustments in April, so I would love to see Unicorn gradually released by the ban list. And finally guys, we have the unlimited cards. So here we have a few cards that I think can pretty safely come off of the ban list. I mean, like both Dark Arm Dragon and Damage Juggler went to 2 before, and neither of them has really done anything noteworthy, so we could probably see them come to 3 and they would be fine. And then Cyberstein, I think I saw one video where someone did like some sort of combo with Reprodicus and they made Cyberstein a Psychic, and then they equip that spell that makes it so that you don't have to pay cost for psychic monster effects, and then they made some sort of crazy board. But realistically, like, Cyberstein isn't going to have any sort of competitive influence on the meta. So yeah, nothing really to say about the unlimited cards here, other than that it's just to like clean up a few of the cards that were taking up space. Alright guys, that is it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully you don't all hate each of my ban list choices. I tried to sort of balance out like my own personal opinions on the meta with how I felt like Konami would approach the list, and I think that the list actually does a pretty good job of that. I think that it would keep a lot of the meta decks currently largely like intact, but hit them enough that when the April list comes around we could introduce a whole new wave of decks without too much difficulty. Anyways guys, please thumbs up the video if you enjoyed it and agreed with at least some of my predictions, and of course be sure to let me know what you guys' lists are and what you think is going to happen on the ban list in the comments section down below, and of course make sure that you are subscribed to MST.TV for all of the latest Yu-Gi-Oh content from Tombox and myself, and yeah, as always, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.